with all y'all who are here. Let us pray. Almighty God, we give you thanks for the gift of the Holy Scriptures to communicate your love for us. We pray that by your grace, that the words of Scripture would be not just signs on a page, but channels of grace into our hearts. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so off we go into Matthew chapter 8, and essentially, as far as the lectionary is concerned, Matthew, almost the entirety of chapters 8 and 9 are omitted, but are often heard in parallel. So, in Matthew's Gospel, chapters 8 and 9 have a lot of the material from, what I talked about last time is, the common source material on Jesus' sayings. And so we start with Matthew chapter 8, verses 1 through 4, the cleansing of the leper. And this is something that we hear in Mark's Gospel. Now, Mark has the cleansing of the leper way earlier in his narrative. So Mark begins his narrative really with Jesus just right out of the gate, doing some healings and confronting demons and speaking with authority. Right away, Jesus is, or as Mark would say, immediately, Jesus starts having power pour from him. Matthew moves all those healings that are in the end of chapter 1 and through chapter 2 of Mark, he moves those after the Sermon on the Mount. Right? So all those very familiar healings in Mark, Matthew moves them towards the middle of his narrative. So basically, after we hear the Sermon on the Mount, in a sense, what we're about to hear are healings, which in some ways are Jesus enacting the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor, blessed are the weak, blessed are those who mourn, because he is about to bless those who are in mourning, those who are sick, etc. So this is kind of for Matthew, he sees healings. So Mark will see healings by Jesus has signs of power, right? This is a healing is Jesus's powerful confrontation with the powers of darkness, evil, and sin and death, which begins right out of the gate. For Matthew, it's a very subtle, very nuanced shift where healings become ways in which the Sermon on the Mount, especially, is opened up, in a sense, preached through action. Like Jesus is about to show what the effects of kingdom life are through these healings. So, the cleansing of the leper, we hear this in Mark, but there is a difference between the two accounts, so that at the end of the cleansing of the leper, in Mark, Jesus strictly commanded him not to tell anyone. So we covered this when we were going through Mark, the messianic secret, right? And the meaning of the messianic secret has, in a sense, Jesus' commitment to the way of nonviolence and to kind of bringing power out of weakness. And so keeping things that are the kind of the miraculous secret was Jesus' way of being unlike the authorities of the Gentiles who kind of rule over their people. So here in Matthew, you have another charge to secrecy, but it's a little bit different. In verse 4 it says, "And Jesus said to him, 'See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a proof to the people.'" That is a Matthean difference. So basically you have what's in parallel with Mark is the command to secrecy, the command to silence. But then what's followed in Matthew is a direction to go to the town priest, to the local Levite, show yourself as a proof. So here the messianic secret, in a sense, is shaped and directed as part of a controversy. And this is because in Matthew's Gospel, much more than in say Luke's Gospel, Jesus is depicted as one who's in constant controversy with the Pharisees, with the authorities of the Jewish people. Again, this is part of the context of Matthew's Gospel, being in a kind of Jewish Christians, Jewish converts to Jesus Messiah, living in the province of Syria. So they're in that context. And so for them, it's like, how does being a Jew with Jesus differ from being a Jew without? That's what Matthew's community really has to work on. That's what they're shaping this narrative around. And so the Messianic secret is like, basically go show yourself to those who couldn't help you as a proof, right, of the true authority that Jesus has the new Moses. Again, remember, Sermon on the Mount, Mount Sinai, Sermon on the Mount. Jesus had, the disciples sit around Jesus, then the crowds. Jesus is saying the Moses, the law that came from Moses, did not have the power to heal you. I, as the new Moses, as the new deliverer and liberator and redeemer of God's people, Israel, I have the power to heal you. Go, don't tell anybody in the village. Go show that priest over there. Go show the Mosaic priest. So you see so that it's just a very subtle shaping, but how the healings begin to play a role in some of the polemics between Matthew's community and the local synagogues. So this then continues this theme of kind of the contrast between, in a sense, the kind of the Jesus synagogue and the Jewish synagogue is continued in the healing of the centurion's servant, which is, we hear this, actually, this will be coming up this summer in a pulpit near you, right? It's the story of the healing of the centurion's servant is heard in Luke's gospel in the lectionary, and Luke has the most full version of it, which is why the lectionary goes with Luke's version, because he's got lots of wonderful little details that the other gospels don't have. So just to kind of, you may not remember, you may not have this at the tip of your memory, but basically, as he entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, beseeching him and saying, "Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home in terrible distress." And Jesus said to him, "I will come and heal him." But the centurion answered him, "Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes. And to my slave, 'Do this,' and he does it." When Jesus heard him, he marveled, and said to those who followed him, "Truly I say to you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." And then he goes on, and then, I'll stop there. So in Luke, the emphasis on the story is put squarely on faith. It's all about the centurion's faith. And Jesus responds to and rewards the faith of the pagan centurion. It's, for Luke, the story of the healing of the centurion's servant is all about the mission to the Gentiles. Right? It's all about, this gospel is going to go out to the Gentiles. And again, by the time Luke is writing, it already has, with remarkable success. Right? So remember, Luke is an apprentice of Paul. He's seen the growth. That's not something that Matthew is necessarily interested in or has necessarily seen up close. Right? For Matthew, this healing of the centurion's servant serves a different purpose. It's the story of the healing of the centurion's servant is used to illustrate the unheard words. So here's this is what you pay for. So the unheard words in Matthew's gospel that basically are never read in the lectionary. And here it comes. This is the kind of the punch from Jesus. So this starts in verse 11 through 12. I tell you, this is Jesus continuing after he says, "Truly, truly I say to you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." That's an important statement right there, right? "I tell you, many will come from east and west and sit at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness. There men will weep and gnash their teeth." So we protect you from hearing about weeping and gnashing of teeth. Don't scare the children. Don't scare the children about an outer darkness. Nothing to worry about here, people. Nothing to worry about. But for Matthew, this is a key saying of Jesus. And this healing, basically, so you have to hear this, the many will come from east and west and sit at table with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Those verses are kind of a separate saying of Jesus that Matthew has put into the this particular healing, because he feels the two illustrate each other. That is, in this healing, Jesus is indicating that mercy and grace are going to go to the Gentiles after Israel has been given their chance. Right? So remember, in Matthew's gospel, when he sends out the 70 or the disciples to minister, he sends them only to the towns of Israel. He said, go only to the towns and villages of Israel. Do not go to the Gentiles. Whereas Luke Jesus just scatters them. It's like, go wherever, go everywhere. Matthew is very targeted. Go first to Israel. Why? Because, in a sense, as to quote Monty Python, you have to wait for it. And so, in Matthew, we have to wait for chapter 28, the end of the story, where Jesus says, go to all nations. That's the final word, this final sending. Luke wants you to know that Jesus always had that in mind, much more than Matthew. But in a sense, the Roman centurion is the prototype of those who will come from east and west. He stands as the symbol of those who will come around the table. And it also, this healing illustrates, what does it mean to sit at table? What does it mean to be at the banquet? It means healing. It means restoration. It means being made whole. It means being saved. All those words being either cognate or, in Greek. So healing, being made whole, being saved, that's what it means to sit at table in the kingdom of God. So that's why the healing is set in the context of inclusion of Gentiles at the banquet. This is an eschatological, it says for Matthew, this is not about, for Luke, remember, it's about faith and the immediate response of faith. For Matthew, this healing is an eschatological sign of what the kingdom is like. Right? So in a sense, Matthew kind of punts the meaning of the healing out of the narrative, to the end of the ages. Right? Where, remember, Jesus says at the end of the story, I'll be with you at the end of the ages, along with the Gentiles. Along with my Gentile followers, we'll all be with you to the end of the age. So there's this joyful gathering of God's people, and so also in the background of this is Isaiah chapter 2, verses 3 through 4. Many people shall come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall arbitrate from many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Again, this is repeated in Micah, by the prophet Micah, this word from God. So the wonderful, here in Matthew, what you have, you have this eschatological perspective on this healing. And isn't it wonderful? It's a centurion who is there in the cause of war. Right? I mean, that's his business. His business is making war. His business is using swords. And in a sense, this healing of the centurion's servant is this wonderful anticipation of this eschatological vision from Isaiah that Matthew has in the background, that basically here is the centurion, in a sense, being brought into the kingdom of peace, right? The centurion's sword is beaten into a plowshare, in a sense, through this intervention of Jesus. So this is that's all part of that Jesus's inclusion of the Gentiles is also a healing of the nations. I will judge and arbitrate between nations. The nation that doesn't come off so well, of course, is the nation of Israel for Matthew. And that's, in a sense, sons of the kingdom. And it's interesting, it says, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will sit at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown in. And of course, sons of the kingdom is Matthew's way, or kind of an Aramaic, or kind of, probably might have come from, straight from Jesus' own mouth, but that's, you hear that, the equivalent saying in Paul would be Israel according to the flesh, right? Basically, ethnic Israel. So in a sense, you have the sons of the kingdom, who are the rightful heirs. They're going to be left out because they have not responded to this ministry of the Messiah. So that's kind of for Matthew, that's one of the important things that's going on in this healing. And so we go on to the next healing, which is Matthew 8. We have the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. Before that, again, we hear that verbatim in Mark's gospel. And again, a healing of Peter's mother-in-law that happens in Mark right after Jesus has his first sermon in Capernaum at the synagogue, and he goes right from that synagogue to Peter's house, and immediately he's brought to, they tell him about Peter's mother-in-law, and he heals her. So that's way at the beginning. Again, that healing, so he's clustering the healings, just like he clusters sayings. That's just Matthew's style. He likes to have kind of like all the brass in the brass section, all the winds in the wind section, and the percussion in the percussion section. So it's like, I'm going to give you all these sayings here, and then I'm going to give you a whole bunch of, of healings here, and then we'll do, and he'll just go back and forth between saying versus Luke, who's a little bit more artistic in how he weaves his narrative. And then, so you move to the sick healed at evening, which is Matthew chapter 8, verses 16 through 17. Just basically, it's a note in all that's paralleled in all three Gospels. This comes in Mark. Mark has it too. That basically there was an evening, right, which is basically stands for a lot of Jesus's evenings. It's not just in other words, he didn't just do this one evening, but it was basically, it's a way for the Gospels to tell you this is what life with Jesus was like. Basically, in the evenings after he was done teaching, he would get swamped. Just crowds of people would come to him, right? So that evening they brought him many who were possessed with demons. In Mark, that evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons. In Luke, now when the sun was setting, all those who had any that were sick with various diseases brought them to him. So again, this is just I think in some ways you just have to, because it tells you, it's trying to tell you a story in a concise way. They don't say, and then that evening too, they kept bringing more people, and then another evening. So they just give you one evening to stand for all of them, just to give you the character of Jesus' existence. And so you kind of get an understanding of why Jesus from time to time had to flee and run away, and why he would say to his disciples, let's get out of here. This is just, he was just clearly, constantly beset by human need. And he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick. This was to fulfill, so far Matthew is just repeating what Mark and Luke has, but then Matthew adds his Matthean difference. This is an editorial comment that is in verse 17. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. He took our infirmities and bore our diseases. Interesting. Typically, you hear that passage from Isaiah in Holy Week, right? That's Isaiah 52:53. By his wounds we were healed. He took our infirmities. He was nothing, to look upon. He was spat at. That whole passage of the suffering servant. So, again, it's in these subtle ways I want to draw your attention to. It's in these sorts of subtle ways that the gospel writers shape their materials that they're working with to help you understand something important about Jesus from their perspective. Right? So for Matthew, again, as I said, Matthew has it, since this it's much later, and it's a summary of several, basically it's a combination of several discrete healing incidents. And you have this fulfillment formula that links Jesus' healing ministry specifically to the suffering servant. That the healing ministry is part of Jesus's ministry as the suffering servant of Israel, which again subtly shifts the emphasis away from the miraculous towards the cross. By putting in here, this was basically, so Jesus is doing all these healings. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. He took our infirmities and bore our diseases. Is basically saying, number one, that the cross and the healings inform each other. That you need to see the two in light of each other. So that, in a sense, Jesus' healings are a part of his taking on, and it is part of his suffering, that basically the suffering humanity gets brought to Jesus. But also that the cross itself is a part of Jesus' vocation of healing humanity. It's not only about sin. Not that sin isn't important. Don't go from this place. Say Father Rob says that the cross doesn't heal sin. That's not, that or doesn't forgive sins. I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is that Matthew wants you to understand through this fulfillment formula from Isaiah that the cross is also about healing a sick humanity. It's also part of it. That's what Jesus was doing on the cross. It wasn't, I like to think that sometimes people think of the sins and the bad things they've done as like hatch marks on a chalkboard, like, bad thing, 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 bad thing. And then, oh, Jesus, help me. And then, kind of Jesus comes in, he erases it every time you confess your sins. He erases the hatch marks, and then you start adding more the next day, and then, oh, forgive me, Jesus. And it's that sort of back and forth, and that's what Christian life is like. And by no means is that the way this is supposed to work, right? That we are called to be fundamentally healed. That in the cross, Jesus is going to the root of the problem, which is our separation from God's love, our unwillingness to view ourselves as beloved of God. That it's that separation from God's own life that is the root of all sin, and that's what Jesus comes to heal on the cross. So that there's this healing of the very nature of humanity itself. And humanity has, and especially in the context of demonic possession, has playing a prominent role in these evenings with Jesus. Again, demonic possession standing for, right, and basically being indicative of the humanity's being in the grips of and enslaved by resistance and rebellion against God's loving purposes, right? Being, in a sense, being occupied. And that's why you have to hear that, because in a sense, the person who is possessed of an unclean spirit is in a sense occupied, right? That the person is made good. The person is a beloved child of God who's under enemy occupation. And can you see how possession by unclean spirit would really register with Jews in Palestine in the Roman period? That this is our beautiful land, right? We're in our home, where God wanted us to be. He created us to be here, and yet we're under occupation by these horrible pagan Romans. And how the two things would be linked up together. But what Jesus is doing by defeating the demonic and confronting and defeating the demonic and linking that to the cross is that he's trying to say to Israel, the Romans aren't your real occupiers. Satan and sin and death are your real occupiers. They're your true enemies. They're the enemies, not the Romans. Satan, sin, and death. They're the enemy. And that's what he came to defeat on the cross. So, in a sense, Matthew's trying to push or shape your reading of the gospel and your reading of these healings through these simple little cues, right? Which you'll never hear. You'll never hear it, but it's there in Matthew. You won't hear it in the others. So, So again, we go through the rest of 8 and even into 9 is very much paralleled. Again, the minor differences around Jesus being where some will say, for example, the saying, Jesus, Luke will say, someone came up to Jesus and wanted to follow him, and Jesus said, foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. So it's kind of the first failed follower, right? And in Matthew, that person is a scribe, right? So for Matthew, the first failed follower is a scribe, which is, they're horrible, and Jesus didn't want them around anyway. So so whereas Luke and Mark have that unspecified. Okay, so we're going to go to Matthew 9, where there's another real difference between Matthew and the rest of the Gospels. In Matthew chapter 9, verses 27 through 31. And this is the healing of 2 blind men. Now, this story, this narrative from the Gospel is, let me turn to it real quick. Number 96, there it is. So, in the other Gospels, this is actually kind of paralleled 3 different times, and scholars tend to see this as Jesus only healed a blind man in Jericho. So in the parallel that I have, that I work with, it has Luke and Mark and Matthew's healing of blind Bartimaeus in Jericho. Now that should be familiar to you. Blind Bartimaeus, he's in Jericho. You hear that. In Mark, the Gospel of Mark. Mark gives you the name Bartimaeus, and then translates it for you. It means son of Timaeus. I love that. He's like, Bartimaeus means son of Timaeus. It's like, oh, got that. Thank you, Mark. And Luke leaves the name out because this, in a sense, is more removed in history, right? By the time Luke's writing, so for him, the name of the blind man is not important. So Matthew has that too, but Matthew has another healing of a blind man, and he has 2. And this is something that this is a common Matthean pattern. Matthew likes to double things. So it's like if Jesus did it 1 person, Matthew wants you to know he did it to 2. And for example, on Palm Sunday, Jesus rides in on a donkey. Well, Matthew has where in Isaiah it says your king will come to you, or not Matthew, it's Zechariah. Your king will come to you riding on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Well, that's parallel. It means the same thing, right? A colt and a foal of a donkey. Well, Matthew reads that. It's interesting. For some reason, Matthew reads that literally has on a colt and on a foal of a donkey. And so in Matthew's Palm Sunday, there's Jesus, and they've got a colt and a foal of a donkey that he's riding. It's like he's riding. It's kind of like, how is he doing this? He's like surfing or something on these 2. But Matthew, it's kind of, Matthew has this weird take sometimes where he's like not 1 but 2. There were 2 donkeys there. And there wasn't just 1 guy in Jericho who was blind. There were 2 guys. And there wasn't just 1 leper. There were 2 lepers. He does that again and again and again. He doubles up. So now we have a doubling of a doubling. So we're going to have 2 blind men in Jericho, and now we have 2 other blind men earlier in the narrative. So clearly, the lectionary people think, oh, well, you're going to hear about a healing on a blind guy later. We don't need to, give you more healings of blind people. But so what is this about? What does this mean to Matthew? That's the question I always bring to it, right? Why would Matthew include this? Of course, we know that Jesus undoubtedly healed numerous blind people, right? Because it says in the evenings, anybody with any condition came to him. So we know that the healing of the blind, we know that when John the Baptist says, hey, are you the Messiah, or are we waiting for somebody else? Or kind of like, when are you going to be starting this insurrection, basically? When are you going to start the revolution, Jesus? And Jesus says, go back to him and say, the blind are being healed, the lame walk, etc., etc. So, in a sense, there's this new theme that is being presented. It says, as Jesus passed on from there, 2 blind men followed him. And that's significant. The blind men are following Jesus. In Jericho, he kind of comes up on them. They're sitting at the gate of Jericho, which is where blind beggars would normally sit, because that's the main traffic, and they'd have their hands out, and people would give them money. These 2 men are following Jesus. How they're doing this, we don't know. But it says they're managing to follow him and crying aloud, "Have mercy on us, Son of David." So they're crying out with a messianic title. Normally, only the demons know who Jesus is at this point in the narrative. Right? The demons are saying, "We know who you are. You're the Son of David, the Holy One of God." And Jesus, basically, "Shut up," and he casts them out. Here you have these 2 blind men crying aloud. And when he entered the house, meaning the house that he was going to stay in that village that night, the blind men came to him. It's like they're following him along. And Jesus said to them, this is fascinating. He doesn't do this in any other place. He says, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" They said to him, "Yes, Lord." Then he touched their eyes. Remember my sermon on touch, for those of you there. This is Jesus touching. He touched their eyes, saying, "According to your faith, be it done to you." And their eyes were opened. And Jesus sternly charged them, "See that no one knows it." But they went away and spread his fame through all that district. So what's going on with this? Why, what does this healing add to our understanding of Jesus? Because if it's important enough for Matthew to include it, because Matthew will take stories from Mark and strip them down. He'll cut out all kinds of details when he tells the same story as Mark does. So why is Matthew adding this in? That clearly this was an incident that Matthew thought was very important for us to know about. In a sense, first of all, you have this testing of faith, which is very uncommon. Jesus says, "Do you believe that I can do this?" Normally, they're already, he remarks on their pre-existing faith, right? They come to him and Jesus says, "Just remember the centurion that I just spoke, I've never seen such faith. This guy's awesome." Or the woman who, with the issue of blood, she reads and says, "Great is your faith. Let, be healed." Here he quizzes them, in a sense. He pushes on them. "Do you believe that I'm able to do this?" And they respond in the affirmative, "Lord," right? Calling him divine Lord. In a sense, they are, and part of what I think is going on here is Matthew is contrasting these 2 blind men, in quotes, who nevertheless are able to see who Jesus is. He's the Son of David, meaning he's the Messiah. He's the real deal. And despite their blindness physically, they follow. And so I think part of what Matthew is saying is, we all come to Jesus. We all try to follow Jesus with our various handicaps, if you will. We all try to follow Jesus with our various deficits, with the things that are wrong with us, right? And that's okay. It's like, stick to him. Whatever it is, stick to him. Follow him. Go all the way to the house, right? Go to the house. Don't let go. Don't walk away. Follow Jesus all the way to the house in which he dwells, right? And ask for what you need. Pray there. Pray to the Jesus whose presence is in that home. And be ready to answer, "Do you believe?" We have to do something in our liturgies every darn time. We believe in one God, Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. We believe in Jesus Christ. You have the opportunity given to you by the church every Sunday to answer Jesus' question to these 2 men. Every Sunday and every day of your life, you have the opportunity to say, "Yes, Lord, I believe." That is what Jesus constantly is asking you. Do you believe in me? And again, belief has trust. And since he's saying, "Do you trust me? Do you trust me?" Think about how the blind man must walk. The blind man must walk through trust, right? As in Hebrews says, we walk by faith. Another way to, again, that same word also means trust. the blind man must trust those who guide him. In a sense, he must trust that when he walks upon a path, somebody hasn't put a stumbling stone. Right? I don't know if I've told you, but basically that's what, like, naughty children would do that to blind people. So you have a blind person in the village who would have a path that they had memorized to the well or to, from one place to another. And so a game that naughty village children would do is they take a stone and they put it right in the path of a blind man. And so the blind man comes along, walking on his path all the time, and then stumbles and falls, and the children are saying, go, tee, and because they're all waiting for it to happen, right? And the Old Testament, the Torah, has a special curse on people who do that, right? Because it's just so mean, it's just vicious to do that sort of thing, right? And so it's like, cursed is the one who places something. And then when Jesus says, when you offend, when you hurt the feelings, when you make one of my brothers, these little ones, feel less valued, less human, you've put a stumbling stone in their path. It'd be better for you if they took a giant millstone around your neck and threw you into the sea. Right? So in a sense, the ways in which we offend each other, the ways in which we hurt each other's feelings, the ways in which we make each other feel less than, are like these little rocks. And to us, they seem like a little rock, and they should just get over it. Just step over it, right? But Jesus says, oh no, you think it's a little rock what you've done. It's actually a giant millstone, right? They'll pull you down. So these blind men who follow Jesus are able to actually see who he is. So it's their faith in Jesus that's important. It's their response to him that's most important. And in this healing, in a sense, it's the key to the key to understanding it is, that our trusting in Jesus allows us to kind of make the distance. We have to trust him with our lives. We have to give over to Jesus our wills, ourselves, and let him heal them. It says, we present ourselves to Jesus, not perfect, right? That's the difference between the old covenant and the new. In the old covenant it says, you shall not give a lamb with a blemish to the Lord your God. You shall not present a crippled goat to the Lord your God. You shall not present, the worst, kind of that ugly one in your flock. Oh, I'll give the Lord that one, right? And then keep for yourself all the best. You understand, we're the crippled goats, right? Who are offered. But in Jesus, he accepts the offering of crippled goats like us. Right? He accepts the offering of blemished sheep for his kingdom. He accepts 2 blind men. He accepts lepers. People, he basically, broken people are who Jesus wants to follow him. Broken people. Right? All the perfect people in this story, they're sitting outside going, I don't like what that guy's doing. I don't like, blind, because there are people in this world who think that blind people ought to stay blind. Broken people ought to stay broken. Just stay in your place. But Jesus has a word to us that's not God's will. God's will is for the healing of peoples, including ourselves. Including ourselves. So it's a wonderful story that I think that adds to our understanding of Jesus' love and his mission, his grace, and how he wants to respond to us. Then it says, he sternly charged them, see that no one knows it. And we know that Jesus basically doesn't want the wrong sort of attention. Since the attention that Jesus wants to attract, he wants to attract people who are attracted to smallness, to powerlessness, to littleness. That's who Jesus is wanting, right? And people who are attracted to the spectacular, to the powerful, etc. He doesn't want that word to get out, right? Because they're not going to go the distance. They're not going to go the distance. The people who go the distance with Jesus are people who are attracted to powerless love, right? To small things being made great, to broken things being made healed. people who are interested in power going to power, Jesus, don't even tell them about me. It's like, don't waste your time or theirs, because they're not going to hang with me. They're not going to make it. Right? So, all right. So that's so those are those passages of chapters 8 and chapter 9, and kind of just trying to chart for you a little bit the Matthean difference and what Matthew kind of feels is really important as compared to Mark, who we've talked about, or Luke. So next week is chapter 11, so we're going to keep on going. So, all right. For those of you who have not yet come, I will see you in the house. Make it there. Get someone to guide you if necessary. Yeah.